All right, let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a huge question today, one that sits at the very heart of how countries work. What do you do with power? Especially in a place that's divided, where different groups all want a seat at the table. Does sharing power make you stronger, or does it just break you? Let's get into it.
You've probably heard this idea before, right? It makes sense on the surface. The idea that for a country to be strong, it needs one solid central command. Sharing it? Well, that sounds like you're just diluting it, watering it down, making the whole thing weaker. But is it really that simple? Is that equation always correct? What if, and stick with me here, what if the exact opposite is the case? Could sharing power actually be the very thing that holds a country together? Well, that's the big question we're going to dig into. So to really figure this out, we're not going to get lost in a bunch of academic theories. Nope, we're going to look at what happened in the real world. Think of it like a real-life experiment, featuring two democracies that were facing the exact same challenge.
So let's meet our two case studies, Belgium and Sri Lanka. Now, at first glance, these two places had a surprising amount in common. Both were pretty small countries, both were democracies, and crucially, both had these really complex populations, different languages, different cultures, all mixed together. They were, in a way, the perfect test cases.
Okay, so to really get why they made the decisions they did, we have to understand what they were up against. So let's take a closer look at the makeup of each of these nations.
All right, first up, Belgium. The country was basically split between two main language groups. You had the Dutch speakers, the Flemish, making up a 59% majority. Then you had the French speakers, the Walloons, at a pretty substantial 40%. And yeah, there was a tiny German-speaking community too. But wait, it gets a little more complex than that.
Because here's the kicker, the capital city, Brussels. In Brussels, everything was flipped on its head. The French speakers, who were the minority in the rest of the country, were a massive 80% majority in the capital. So the national minority was the local majority. You can just imagine the tension that created.
Now, let's hop over to Sri Lanka. The situation there was, well, a lot more lopsided. The Sinhala-speaking community was the clear dominant majority. We're talking 74%. The Tamil speakers, on the other hand, were a much smaller minority, just 18%.
So here's the bottom line. You have two democracies, both with a clear majority group and at least one minority group. And they both had to stare down the exact same fundamental question. How is the majority going to treat the minority?
And the answers they came up with, well, they couldn't have been more different. And as we're about to see, those choices put them on two completely different paths with dramatically different outcomes.
Sri Lanka went down a path called majoritarianism. And the idea is pretty straightforward. If you're the majority, you get to rule the country however you want. You can basically disregard what the minority wants or needs. It's kind of like treating democracy as a winner-take-all game. And this way of thinking had very real, very quick consequences. Right after independence, in 1956, they passed an act that made Sinhala the only official language. Then came policies that gave preferential treatment to Sinhala speakers for university spots and government jobs. With every move like this, the Tamil community felt more and more pushed aside, more alienated, and eventually that distrust exploded into a terrible civil war. But Belgium looked at its own complicated situation and chose a totally different path. They didn't go for dominance. They went for accommodation. They basically said, look, if we're going to make this work, we have to find a way for everyone to feel included. And man, did they get creative. Between 1970 and 1993, they actually changed their constitution 4 times to get it right. They did things like requiring the central government to have an equal number of Dutch and French-speaking ministers. That way, no single group could just call all the shots. They created state governments with real power, a separate government for Brussels with equal representation, and even a community government just to handle language and cultural stuff. It sounds really complex, I know, but the goal behind it all was super simple. Make sure everyone has a voice. So when you put it side by side, the results are just stark. In Sri Lanka, majoritarianism created deep resentment, it led to a brutal civil war, and it fractured the country. In Belgium, their complicated model of accommodation helped them avoid that kind of strife and ultimately kept the country united. It just goes to show, the choices you make about power aren't abstract. They have life and death consequences.
So these two stories, these two very different paths, bring us back to our original question. And they show us that there are really two big reasons why sharing power isn't a weakness at all. It's actually a source of strength.
You can think about it in 2 ways. First,
There are what we call prudential reasons. This is the it's smart argument. You share power because it reduces the chance of conflict, because it leads to political stability. It's a pragmatic choice for a better, more peaceful country. But then there are the moral reasons. This is the it's right argument. This view says that sharing power is the very spirit of democracy. People have a right to have a say in how they're governed, and a government that includes everyone is more legitimate.
Okay, so we've established why it's a good idea to share power. But how do you actually do it? How do modern democracies put this into practice? Well, it turns out there isn't just one way. It's more like a whole toolkit of different methods.
So you've got 4 main approaches. First, you can share power horizontally. Think of your classic checks and balances between the legislature, the executive, and the courts. Second, you can share it vertically. That's federalism, where power is divided between a national government and state or local governments. Third, you can share power among different social, religious, or language groups, like we saw in Belgium. And finally, you can see it shared among political parties, like when they form coalition governments. 4 different tools, all designed to do the same thing: spread power around.
So the big takeaway here is that power sharing isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's a design for a more stable and just society. But, and this is a big but, that doesn't mean it's simple. Sometimes the very systems you create to solve one problem can create a whole new set of challenges.
And to see what I mean, let's look at one last story. I want you to meet Khalil. He's from Beirut, in Lebanon. Now, after a really vicious civil war, Lebanon put in place this very strict power-sharing formula, where the top jobs, president, prime minister, are all reserved for people from specific religious groups. The whole point was to guarantee peace. Khalil, though, he's frustrated. He's smart, he's ambitious, he's got big ideas, but under this system, he can't ever run for the top job simply because of the community he was born into. And he's asking, why can't we just be a normal democracy? Just have an election and whoever gets the most votes wins, no matter who they are. He feels like the system that's meant to protect the country is holding him back.
But then you talk to his elders, the generation that lived through the Civil War. They remember the bloodshed. And for them, this system isn't about holding anyone back. For them, it is the only thing that guarantees peace. It's the wall that's preventing the country from sliding back into chaos.
And that's where I want to leave you today, with that dilemma. If you had the power to rewrite the rules, what would you do? Would you take a chance on Khalil's vision of a normal democracy, even if it risks stability? Or would you stick with the elder system, which keeps the peace but limits individual ambition? There's no easy answer, is there?